The Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929 stands as one of the most notorious chapters in the annals of American crime history. Occurring on February 14th, 1929, in Chicago, Illinois, this brutal event marked a pivotal moment in the Prohibition-era gang wars that gripped the city. 7 members of the Northside Gang, led by George "Bugs" Moran, were brutally gunned down in a garage by rival gangsters disguised as police officers. The massacre, attributed to the notorious Al Capone's Chicago outfit, sent shockwaves across the nation, highlighting the extreme violence and lawlessness that characterised the era. Our episodes deal with serious and often distressing incidents. If at any time you feel like you need support, please contact your local crisis centre. This episode discusses murder and may contain details of graphic violence. It may not be suitable for all listeners. Listener discretion is advised. The Valentine's Day Massacre began with a meticulously planned ambush orchestrated by members of the Chicago outfit led by Al Capone, targeting their rival gang, the Northside Gang, led by George "Bugs" Moran. On the morning of February 14th, 1929, members of the Northside Gang, including Bugs Moran, were gathered at the SMC Cartage Company garage in Chicago, which served as one of their headquarters. Unbeknownst to them, 4 men, 2 of whom were dressed as police officers, arrived at the garage in what appeared to be a police car. Upon their arrival, the fake police officers, along with their accomplices, entered the garage and ordered the Northside Gang members to line up against a wall. Under the pretense of conducting a routine police raid, the gunmen then opened fire on the unsuspecting victims with Tommy guns and shotguns. In a matter of minutes, a barrage of gunfire erupted in the garage, resulting in the deaths of 7 Northside Gang members, including individuals who were mistakenly identified as Bugs Moran himself. The attackers quickly fled the scene, leaving behind a grisly tableau of carnage. The victims included 5 members of Bugs Moran's Northside Gang. Moran's second-in-command and brother-in-law, Albert Kashelek, was killed along with Adam Hayer, the gang's bookkeeper and business manager, Albert Weinshank, who managed several cleaning and dyeing operations for Moran, and gang enforcers Frank Gusenberg and Peter Gusenberg. 2 associates were also shot, Reinhard Schwimmer, a former optician turned gambler and gang associate, and John May, an occasional mechanic for the Moran gang. Chicago police officers arrived at the scene to find that victim Frank Gusenberg was still alive, despite having sustained 14 bullet wounds. He was taken to the hospital, where doctors stabilised him for a short time, and police tried to question him. When the police asked him who did it, he reportedly replied, "I won't talk, for God's sake, get me to a hospital." He died 3 hours later. The massacre was an attempt to eliminate Bugs Moran, head of the Northside Gang. Al Capone, who was at his Florida home at the time, was widely assumed to have been responsible for ordering the massacre. The impetus for the plan may have been the Northside Gang's hijacking of some expensive whiskey being illegally smuggled by Capone's gang from Canada via the Detroit River. Moran was the last survivor of the Northside gunmen. His succession had come about because his similarly aggressive predecessors, Jaime Weiss and Vincent Drucke, had been killed in the violence that followed the murder of their original leader, Dean O'Banion. Several factors contributed to the timing of the plan to kill Moran. Moran and Capone had been vying for control of the lucrative Chicago bootlegging trade. Moran had also been muscling in on a Capone-run dog track in the Chicago suburbs, and he had taken over several saloons that were run by Capone, insisting that they were in his territory. Earlier in the year, Northsider Frank Gusenberg and his brother Peter unsuccessfully attempted to murder Jack McGurn, who was a made man, a fully initiated member, and later Capo Regime, or Capo, informally referred to as Captain, in Al Capone's Chicago outfit. The Northside Gang was also complicit in the murders of Pasqualino, Patsy, Lolordo, and Antonio the Scourge Lombardo. Both had been presidents of the Union Siciliana, the local mafia, and close associates of Capone. The plan was to lure Moran to the SMC Cartage warehouse on North Clark Street on February 14, 1929, to kill him and perhaps 2 or 3 of his lieutenants. It is usually assumed that the Northsiders were lured to the garage with the promise of a stolen cut-rate shipment of whiskey supplied by Detroit's Purple Gang, which was associated with Capone. The Gusenberg brothers were supposed to drive 2 empty trucks to Detroit that day to pick up 2 loads of stolen Canadian whiskey. All of the victims were dressed in their best clothes, with the exception of John May, as was customary for the Northsiders and other gangsters at the time. Most of the Moran gang arrived at the warehouse by approximately 10:30 a.m, but Moran was not there, having left his Parkway Hotel apartment late. He and fellow gang member Ted Newbury were approaching the rear of the warehouse from a side street when they saw a police car nearing the building. They immediately turned and retraced their steps, going to a nearby coffee shop. They encountered gang member Henry Gusenberg on the street and warned him, so he too turned back. Northside gang member Willie Marks also spotted the police car on his way to the garage and ducked into a doorway and jotted down the license plate before leaving the neighbourhood. Capone's lookouts likely mistook one of Moran's men, probably Albert Weinshank, who was the same height and build, for Moran himself. The physical similarities between the 2 men was enhanced by their dress that morning. Both happened to be wearing the same colour overcoats and hats. Witnesses outside the garage saw a Cadillac sedan pull up to a stop in front. 4 men emerged and walked inside, 2 of them dressed in police uniforms. The 2 fake police officers carried shotguns and entered the rear portion of the garage, where they found members of Moran's gang and associates Reinhard Schwimmer and John May, who was fixing one of the trucks. The fake policeman then ordered the men to line up against the wall, then signalled to the pair in civilian clothes who had accompanied them. 2 of the killers opened fire with Thompson submachine guns, one with a 20-round box magazine and the other a 50-round drum. They were thorough, spraying their victims left and right, even continuing to fire after all 7 had hit the floor. 2 shotgun blasts all but obliterated the faces of John May and Albert Kashelak, according to the coroner's report. To give the appearance that everything was under control, the men in street clothes came out with their hands up, prodded by the 2 uniformed policemen. Inside the garage, the only survivors in the warehouse were May's dog, Highball, and Frank Gusenberg. Despite 14 bullet wounds, he was still conscious, but died 3 hours later, refusing to identify the killers. At this time, murder was not a federal offence. Most of the killers hired were from out of town. Police departments from different cities rarely could work together to solve crimes at the time, so the killers knew if they simply left Chicago after the massacre, nobody could touch them. The Valentine's Day Massacre set off a public outcry which posed a problem for all bosses of the National Crime Syndicate. Within days, Capone received a summons to testify before a Chicago grand jury on charges of federal prohibition violations, but he said he was too unwell to attend. It was common knowledge that Moran was hijacking Capone's Detroit-based liquor shipments, but police focused their attention on Detroit's predominantly Jewish Purple Gang. Landladies Mrs. Doody and Mrs. Ordvidson had taken in 3 men as roomers 10 days before the massacre, and their rooming houses were directly across the street from the North Clark Street gang. They picked out mugshots of Purple Gang members George Lewis, Eddie Fletcher, Phil Keywell, and his younger brother Harry. But the ladies later wavered in their identifications. The police questioned and cleared Fletcher, Lewis, and Harry Keywell. Nevertheless, the Keywell brothers, and by extension the Purple Gang, remained associated with the crime in the years that followed. Many also believed that the police were involved, which may have been the intentions of the killer. On February 22nd, police were called to the scene of a garage fire on Wood Street, where they found a 1927 Cadillac sedan disassembled and partially burned, and determined that the killers had used the car. They traced the engine number to a Michigan Avenue dealer who had sold the car to a James Morton of Los Angeles. The garage had been rented by a man calling himself Frank Rogers, who gave his address as 1859 West North Avenue. This was the address of the Circus Cafe, operated by Claude Maddox, a former St. Louis gangster with ties to the Capone Gang, the Purple Gang, and the St. Louis Gang, Egan's Rats. Police could not turn up any information about persons named James Morton or Frank Rogers, but they had a definite lead on one of the killers. Just minutes before the killings, a truck driver named Elmer Lewis had turned a corner a block away from 2122 North Clark and sideswiped a police car. He told police that he stopped immediately but was waved away by the uniformed driver, who was missing a front tooth. Board of Education President H. Wallace Caldwell had witnessed the accident, and he gave the same description of the driver. Police were confident that they were describing Fred Burke, a former member of Egan's Rats. Burke and a close companion named James Ray were known to wear police uniforms whenever on a robbery spree. Burke was also a fugitive, under indictment for robbery and murder in Ohio. Police also suggested that Joseph Lalordo could have been one of the killers because of his brother Pasqualino's recent murder by the Northside Gang. Police then announced that they suspected Capone gunman John Scalise and Albert Anselmi, as well as Jack McGurn and Frank Rio, a Capone bodyguard. Police eventually charged McGurn and Scalise with the massacre. The police later dropped the murder charges against Jack McGurn because of a lack of evidence. McGurn was just charged with a violation of the Mann Act when he took his girlfriend, Louise Rolfe, across state lines to marry. The case stagnated until December 14, 1929, when the Berrien County, Michigan Sheriff's Department raided the St. Joseph, Michigan bungalow of Frederick Dane, the registered owner of a vehicle driven by Fred Burke. Burke had been drinking that night, then rear-ended another vehicle and drove off. Patrolman Charles Skelly pursued, finally forcing him off the road. Skelly hopped onto the running board of Burke's car, but he was shot 3 times and died of his wounds that night. The car was found wrecked and abandoned just outside St. Joseph and traced to Fred Dane. But this time, police photos confirmed that Dane was in fact Fred Burke, wanted by the Chicago police for his participation in the St. Valentine's Day massacre. Police raided Burke's bungalow and found a large trunk containing a bulletproof vest, almost $320,000 in bonds recently stolen from a Wisconsin bank, 2 Thompson submachine guns, pistols, 2 shotguns, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. St. Joseph authorities immediately notified the Chicago police, who requested both machine guns. They used the new science of forensic ballistics to identify both weapons as those used in the massacre. They also discovered that one of them had also been used to murder New York mobster Frankie Yale a year and a half earlier. Unfortunately, no further concrete evidence surfaced in the massacre case. Burke was captured over a year later on a Missouri farm. The case against him was strongest in connection to the murder of Officer Skelly, so he was tried in Michigan and subsequently sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in prison in 1940. On January 8, 1935, FBI agents surrounded a Chicago apartment building at 3920 North Pine Grove, looking for the remaining members of the Barker gang. A brief shootout erupted resulting in the death of bank robber Russell Gibson. Taken into custody were Doc Barker, Byron Bolton, and 2 women. Bolton was a Navy machine gunner and associate of Egan's Rats, and he had been the valet of Chicago hitman Fred Getz. Byron Bolton was privy to many of the Barker gang's crimes and pinpointed the Florida hideout of Ma Barker and Freddie Barker, both of whom were killed in a shootout with the FBI a week later. Bolton said he took part in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre with Getz, Fred Burke, and several others. The FBI had no jurisdiction in a state murder case, so they kept Bolton's revelations confidential until the Chicago American newspaper reported a second-hand version of his confession. The newspaper declared that the crime had been solved despite being stonewalled by J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI, who did not want any part of the massacre case. Garbled versions of Bolton's story went out in the national media. Bolton, it was reported, said that the plan to murder Bugs Moran had been plotted in October or November 1928 at a Wisconsin resort owned by Fred Getz. Present at this meeting were Getz, Al Capone, Frank Nitti, Fred Burke, Gus Winkler, Louis Campagna, Daniel Serritella, William Pacelli, and Bolton. The men stayed 2 or 3 weeks, hunting and fishing when they were not planning the murder of their enemies. Bolton said that he and Jimmy Moran were charged with watching the SMC Carthage garage and phoning the signal to the killers at the Circus Cafe when Bugs Moran arrived at the meeting. Police had found a letter addressed to Bolton in the Lookout Nest and possibly a vial of prescription medication. Bolton guessed that the actual killers had been Burke, Winkler, Getz, Bob Carey, Raymond Nugent, and Claude Maddox, 4 shooters and 2 getaway drivers. Bolton gave an account of the massacre different from the one generally told by historians. He said that he only saw plainclothes men exit the Cadillac and go into the garage. This indicates that a second car was used by the killers. George Brishett said he saw at least 2 uniformed men exiting a car in the alley and entering the garage through its rear doors. A Peerless Motor Company sedan had been found near a Maywood house owned by Claude Maddox in the days after the massacre, and in one of the pockets was an address book belonging to victim Albert Weinshank. Bolton said that he had mistaken one of Moran's men to be Moran, after which he telephoned the signal to the Circus Cafe. The killers had expected to kill Moran and 2 or 3 of his men, but they were unexpectedly confronted with 7 men. They simply decided to kill them all and get out fast. Bolton said that Capone was furious with him for his mistake and the resulting police pressure and threatened to kill him, only to be dissuaded by Fred Getz. Bolton's claims were corroborated by Gus Winkler's widow, Georgette, in an official FBI statement and in her memoirs, which were published in a 4-part series in a True Detective magazine during the winter of 1935 and 1936. She revealed that her husband and his friends had formed a special crew used by Capone for high-risk jobs. The mob boss was said to have trusted them implicitly and nicknamed them the American Boys. Bolton's statements were also backed up by William Drury, a Chicago detective who had stayed on the massacre case long after everyone else had given up. Bank robber Alvin Karpis later said to have heard secondhand from Ray Nugent about the massacre and that the American Boys were paid a collective salary of $2,000 a week, plus bonuses. Karpis also said that Capone had told him while they were in Alcatraz together that Getz had been the actual planner of the massacre. Despite Byron Bolton's statements, no action was taken on them by law enforcement. Bolton had died on October 7, 1938, in the Illinois State Penitentiary System, after being convicted of the murder of a detective during a payroll robbery. The official stance of the Chicago Police Department is that they still consider the case unsolved. Many mobsters have been named as part of the Valentine's Day hit team. Two prime suspects are Cosa Nostra hitmen John Scalise and Albert Anselmi. In the days after the massacre, Scalise was heard to brag, "I am the most powerful man in Chicago." Union Siciliana President Joseph Gunter had recently elevated him to the position of the union's vice president. Nevertheless, Scalise, Anselmi and Gunter were found dead on a lonely road near Hammond, Indiana on May 8, 1929. Gangland lore speculates that Capone had discovered that the pair were planning to betray him and likely to prevent them from testifying against them. Legend states that Capone produced a baseball bat at the climax of a dinner party thrown in their honour and beat the trio to death. Today, the site of the garage where the massacre took place is a parking lot for a nursing home. A small sign on the side of the building facing the parking lot marks the historic location. The bricks of the north wall, against which the victims were shot, were purchased by a Canadian businessman. For many years, they were displayed in various crime-related novelty displays. Many of them were later sold individually, and the remainder are now owned by the Mob Museum in Las Vegas. At first, many thought that the Chicago police had committed the massacre, but most people in Chicago thought that Al Capone was behind the murders. Capone, however, had an alibi. He was at his winter home in Palm Beach, Florida, when the murders took place. The suspicions finally resulted in the arrests of Vincenzo da Mora and John Scalise. These were two of Capone's known henchmen. Scalise was charged with the murders after da Mora came up with an alibi, but after his murder, the police had no evidence to go on. Public opinion also put pressure on the FBI to arrest Capone with any charge they could. In 1931, they finally charged him with tax evasion and sent him to prison. Capone was sent to Alcatraz for 11 years. When he was finally released, he was too sick to continue his crime career. He died in 1947, and with it, his crime spree. Thank you for listening to this episode of Shadow Crimes. If you liked this episode, be sure to follow or subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. Follow us on social media and check out our website at shadowcrimes.com, where mysteries thrive and shadows speak.